I shoved open the heavy oak doors, freezing seawater dripping from my thick rescue wetsuit onto the pristine marble floor. I had just spent 3 agonizing hours fighting rogue waves to pull a little boy from a flooded cave. I sprinted here to marry the love of my life, only to find him at the altar, kissing my lifelong best friend. They thought my absence meant victory, unaware I was about to detonate their entire lives. Hello to our wonderful audience at Violet Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently disabled our monetization, leaving our channel completely without an operating budget. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our dedicated staff, helping them cover their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen or by clicking the donation link down in the video description and the pinned comments. My name is Ember Alexander. The heavy oak doors of the Cape Meridian Cliffside Chapel felt like solid iron against my numb, trembling hands. When I finally pushed them open, the thick wood groaned, a sound that sliced through the delicate string quartet playing softly inside. I stepped over the threshold, my heavy neoprene dive boots coming down with a wet, squelching thud on the imported white Italian marble. With every step I took, thick puddles of freezing, murky seawater pooled around my feet, staining the pristine white runner that had been laid out specifically for my grand entrance. I was a walking, breathing disaster zone intruding upon a perfectly curated fantasy of wealth and romance. I was still tightly encased in my thick, black rescue wetsuit. The bright orange insignia of my coastal rescue unit blazed across my chest, a stark, glaring violation of the chapel's muted pastel color palette. My hair, which was supposed to be pinned up in elegant, soft curls by a team of stylists, hung in heavy, freezing ropes down my back, completely matted with coarse beach sand and bitter sea salt. My chest heaved violently. Every breath I dragged into my burning lungs sounded loud and ragged in the cavernous, quiet space. I was shivering so violently that my teeth chattered, my core body temperature dangerously low from battling the unforgiving ocean currents for 3 hours. But the paralyzing cold radiating from the room had absolutely nothing to do with the sea. The elegant murmurs of the 200 finely dressed guests instantly died in their throats. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavy and deafening. Gasps began to ripple and echo through the high, vaulted ceilings. Hundreds of eyes turned in complete unison, locking onto the disheveled, shivering woman standing at the back of the room. I saw their expressions contort from polite anticipation to sheer, unadulterated shock, and then, slowly, to confusion and pity. I ignored them all. My burning, salt-stung eyes were fixed entirely on the far end of the aisle. There, standing beneath an extravagant, towering archway of white roses, was Nolan. He was my charming, deeply loving groom, looking absolute perfection in a sharply tailored, charcoal gray tuxedo that clung to his broad shoulders exactly the way I had admired during his final fittings. But he was not looking at the doors waiting anxiously for me. He was not looking panicked about my massive delay. He was standing close, far too close, to the woman beside him, tightly holding both of her hands while gazing into her eyes with a look he had always sworn belonged only to me. The woman was Sierra, my lifelong best friend, the woman who had held my hand through every major crisis of my life, the woman who had helped me pick out the very floral arrangements surrounding them now. My vision tunneled, the edges going dark. A physical wave of nausea hit me so hard, I swayed on my unsteady feet. Draped delicately over Sierra's perfectly styled blonde hair was a cascade of antique ivory fabric. I recognized the intricate, hand-stitched floral patterns instantly. It was my grandmother's custom vintage lace veil. It was the only physical piece of my family legacy I had left in the world. The priceless heirloom I had entrusted to Sierra for safekeeping just yesterday. Standing right beside them, bathed in the soft glow of the chapel lights, the officiant was just closing his leather-bound book. The resonant acoustics of the chapel carried his final, damning words directly to my ears, loudly declaring them husband and wife. I tried to force my frozen legs to move, to march down that aisle and scream until the beautiful stained glass shattered into a million pieces. But a figure stepped directly into my path. It was Eleanor, Nolan's mother. She moved with predatory grace, her expensive silk gown rustling as she planted herself firmly on the white runner, physically blocking me from advancing toward the altar. Her face was a tight mask of perfectly sculpted, icy disdain. She leaned in close, the sickeningly sweet scent of her heavy designer perfume clashing violently with the metallic tang of ocean blood and salt on my skin. A woman who cares more about swimming in the mud than showing up for her own groom deserves to be replaced, she whispered, her voice a razor-sharp hiss, meant only for my ears. You abandoned him. Ember, Sierra stepped up to save my son from the terrible humiliation you caused. Turn around and leave before you embarrass yourself further. I stood there in stunned, absolute silence. The betrayal was so massive, so incomprehensibly deep and meticulously executed that my brain simply refused to process the data. But as the room spun and the reality of my ruined life crashed over me, a tiny, deliberate movement caught my periphery. In the very back row, entirely unbothered by the unfolding drama, sat a sharply dressed man in a nondescript navy suit. He did not gasp. He did not stare at my ruined appearance like the rest of the congregation. Instead, his piercing eyes were locked in a dead, unblinking stare right at Nolan and Sierra. Slowly, with deliberate and chilling precision, he unclasped a dark leather briefcase resting on his lap. He quietly slipped a thick, manila file out from the dark interior, his thumb resting gently on the edge of the documents. He watched the newlyweds with the cold, calculating patience of a federal hunter who had just watched his prey step willingly into an inescapable trap. I am 29 years old, and for the entirety of my adult life, my existence has been defined by the violent, unforgiving waters of the Pacific Northwest. I serve as the lead deepwater rescue diver and the operations chief for Valiant Coast Search and Rescue. We are an elite, rapid response agency, the people local authorities call when the Coast Guard cannot make it in time. My days are measured in tidal charts, compressed oxygen, and the desperate act of pulling terrified souls from the jagged jaws of the ocean. It was never just a career for me, it was a profound calling, deeply tied to my bloodline. The agency operates out of a sprawling, completely privately funded coastal compound. It is a pristine, multi-million-dollar stretch of cliffside real estate left to me by my late father. That property was my sanctuary, the very foundation of my life's work. I poured every ounce of my energy into saving strangers, naively believing that if I dedicated my life to protecting others, the people closest to me would naturally protect my heart. That pure, unchecked intention became my fatal blind spot. Exactly 2 years ago, Nolan swept into my chaotic world. As a fiercely ambitious commercial architect, he possessed a polished, grounding energy that seemed to perfectly balance my adrenaline-fueled existence. While other men had always been intimidated by a partner who routinely jumped out of helicopters into raging storm swells, Nolan played the role of the endlessly supportive rock. He would brew my coffee at 3 a.m. when the emergency sirens blared, wrapping his arms around me and whispering how deeply he admired my life-saving career. I truly believed I had found my safe harbor, and hovering right beside that harbor was Sierra. She had been my absolute confidant since our freshman year of high school. Sierra was a luxury lifestyle influencer with incredibly expensive tastes, constantly chasing high-end brand deals and curating a flawless digital aesthetic. Her world of designer clothes and VIP parties was the total opposite of my gritty, salt-stained reality. Yet I cherished our bond, under the guise of helping us plan the ultimate dream wedding. She practically moved into our lives, constantly inserting herself into every decision, every dinner, and every quiet moment Nolan and I tried to share. Looking back now with the clarity of absolute betrayal, the warning signs were flashing like coastal lighthouses in the dead of night, but my unwavering loyalty blinded me to the predators hunting inside my own home. I brushed off the strange, highly specific questions, Nolan began asking about my property deeds and the exact zoning laws governing the cliffside compound. I ignored the times I would come home bone-tired from a 12-hour ocean shift, only to find him hastily rolling up complex architectural blueprints the second my boots hit the hardwood floor. Even worse, I willingly waved away Sierra constantly needing private, closed-door consultations with my fiancé. "We just need to finalize the architectural flow of the venue," she would chirp smoothly, her manicured hand resting lightly on Nolan's arm. "We want the layout to be a total surprise for you on the big day." I trusted them completely. I was so incredibly busy calculating dive trajectories and managing rescue logistics that I failed to see the intricate, devastating logistics they were mapping out for my ruin. The true masterpiece of their deception was the legal trap they set right under my nose. A mere month before the ceremony, Nolan sat me down at our kitchen table, sliding a massive stack of dense legal documents toward me. His eyes were wide and earnest. "My investors are demanding a standard prenuptial agreement before they fund my next big firm expansion." He had lied effortlessly, his hand covering mine. "It is just standard procedure to protect our future, my love." Between organizing disaster relief for a recent coastal hurricane and finalizing our floral arrangements, my brain was completely fried. I skimmed the pages, trusting the man I loved. I completely missed the bizarre, ironclad clauses buried beneath the heavy legal jargon. It was not a standard prenuptial agreement designed to protect our individual assets. It was a meticulously crafted marital contract ensuring that the precise second the officiant pronounced us legally married, all of my assets, specifically including the priceless Valiant Coast property, would instantly become joint holdings. They were banking on my signature and my blind trust, paving the way to steal the only thing my father ever left me. 3 hours before the music was scheduled to start playing, my emergency radio shattered the quiet morning. I was sitting in a velvet chair. A stylist was pinning up my hair. The harsh, blaring siren of the dispatch channel cut through the soft wedding playlist. I snatched the radio. The county sheriff was shouting over a roar of static. A freak, rogue wave had just slammed into the northern tourist outlook. A 7-year-old boy had been swept over the iron railing. He was sucked directly into the ocean. Worse, the current had dragged him straight into the Devil's Maw. The Devil's Maw is a notoriously dangerous, partially submerged volcanic sea cave. It is a death trap of jagged basalt, swirling vortexes, and crushing pressure. The tide was coming in incredibly fast. In exactly 45 minutes, the entire cave system would be completely flooded right up to the ceiling. The local Marine Patrol was already on the scene, but their divers refused to go into the black water. They did not have the technical training to navigate the razor-sharp rocks in zero visibility. They were staring at a death sentence. "We need you right now," the sheriff barked. "You are the only person on this coast who knows the inside of that cave. If you do not get in the water in the next 10 minutes, this kid is gone." I looked at my pristine white dress hanging on the closet door. Then I looked at the radio. There was absolutely no choice. A child was going to die in the dark. I grabbed my cell phone with shaking hands. I dialed my groom. I needed to tell him. I needed him to hold the guests, delay the caterers, and just wait for me. The phone rang once, then it clicked directly to voicemail. I hung up and dialed again. Voicemail. A cold knot of panic twisted in my stomach, but I could not afford to waste another 60 seconds. I hurled the phone into my waterproof dive bag. I stripped off my silk robe. I shoved my arms and legs into my thick, heavy neoprene rescue wetsuit. I sprinted out the door and jumped into the agency helicopter waiting on the tarmac. We flew dangerously low over the churning, slate-gray ocean. The drop zone was an absolute nightmare. 15-foot swells were violently crashing against the black coastal cliffs, exploding into towering walls of white foam. The entrance to the Devil's Maw was a churning washing machine of pure kinetic energy. I strapped my heavy air tank tightly to my back. I checked my primary and secondary air regulators. I clamped the silicone mouthpiece firmly between my teeth. Without a single second of hesitation, I stepped right off the metal skids of the hovering helicopter. I hit the freezing Pacific Ocean like a freight train. The brutal cold instantly tried to steal the breath right out of my lungs. The rip current immediately grabbed my body, trying to drag me out into the deep, open sea. I fought back with everything I had. I kicked my heavy boots hard, angling my body down and shooting straight toward the gaping black mouth of the cave. The visibility was absolute zero. The water was a thick, churning soup of violently ripped kelp and swirling sand. I navigated entirely by touch and muscle memory. The sharp, unforgiving basalt walls tore deeply into the thick fabric of my wetsuit. The violent surge of the incoming waves slammed my shoulders against the narrow stone corridors. Pain flared hot and bright in my collarbone. I ignored it. I kicked harder. The water grew darker and colder. The roar of the crashing ocean outside morphed into a deafening, echoing boom that vibrated deep inside my teeth. I broke the surface of the water inside the main, pitch-black chamber. I flicked on my high-beam helmet light. The harsh white beam cut through the heavy, freezing saltwater mist. The water level was rising furiously, splashing violently against the ceiling. I frantically scanned the jagged, wet walls. There, high up on a tiny, slippery rock ledge near the very back of the cavern, he was just a tiny, soaking wet figure. He was shivering so violently that I could hear his teeth chattering over the roar of the water. His small fingers were bleeding from clinging so desperately to the razor-sharp rocks. His eyes were wide with pure, paralyzing terror. "I have got you!" I yelled loudly over the deafening noise. "I am going to get you out of here safely." I swam furiously to the edge of the ledge. I hauled my heavy body out of the water. I wrapped my strong arms tightly around his freezing little shoulders. I pulled my secondary emergency air regulator from my harness. I secured it tightly over his small mouth and nose. I pulled out heavy nylon rescue straps. I strapped him tightly and securely directly to my own chest. "Breathe completely normal," I instructed firmly, locking my eyes with his terrified stare. "Do not let go of my harness. I am your shield. I will take every hit. Do you understand?" He nodded frantically. We plunged backward off the ledge and into the freezing, violent darkness. The extraction was a harrowing, claustrophobic nightmare. The tide was surging inward now, fighting us aggressively for every single inch of forward progress. We were swimming directly into the teeth of a monster. A massive rogue swell roared directly into the narrow cavern tunnel. I saw the wall of white water coming. I violently spun my body around in the dark. I took the full, crushing impact of the wave directly against my back. The brutal force slammed us heavily into the jagged stone ceiling. My ribs screamed in blinding agony. The heavy plastic of my dive helmet cracked loudly. But I clamped my arms even tighter around the small boy. I became a human battering ram, shielding his fragile bones with my own flesh and muscle. I kicked furiously against the relentless current. My leg muscles burned like fire. My lungs heavily ached for oxygen. We were completely encased in a violent, swirling tomb of black water. Suddenly, the pressure shifted. The watercolor changed instantly from pitch black to a murky, glowing green. We shot violently out of the cave entrance like a cannonball. We broke the surface of the ocean and burst into the blinding, beautiful daylight. The Coast Guard rescue cutter was waiting directly outside the breaker line. Strong hands reached down over the metal railing. They hauled the boy safely up onto the deck. The emergency paramedics swarmed him instantly with thermal blankets and oxygen masks. I collapsed heavily onto the metal grating of the deck. I ripped off my cracked dive mask. I gasped greedily for sweet, clean air. My entire body was shaking violently from the adrenaline and the severe cold. "His vitals are completely stable," a frantic medic shouted down to me. "You saved his life today." I nodded weakly. I reached down into the waterproof zipper pocket on my thigh. I pulled out my cell phone. The screen was completely shattered. The heavy impact against the cave ceiling had crushed the device into a useless brick of bent metal and broken glass. I looked up at the bright red digital clock mounted on the boat console. My heart completely stopped beating. It was exactly 3 hours past the scheduled start time of my wedding ceremony. Sheer, absolute panic finally hit my nervous system. I leaped right off the cutter the exact second it docked roughly at the mainland marina. I did not bother to strip off the heavy dive gear. I did not stop to shower or bandage my bleeding shoulder. I ran straight into the emergency vehicle bay. I hot-wired a heavy-duty, mud-splattered rescue all-terrain vehicle. I slammed my heavy dive boot down on the gas pedal. I sped recklessly up the winding, dangerous coastal highway. The freezing coastal wind whipped my wet, tangled hair. Mud and salt water sprayed aggressively across the cracked windshield. I pushed the roaring engine to its absolute limit, tearing around sharp cliffside corners on two wheels. I prayed the entire agonizing drive toward the chapel. I prayed he was waiting. I prayed he would understand the delay. I drove with the absolute delusion that the man I loved would look at my bruised, bleeding, salt-stained body, see the empty rescue straps hanging from my chest, and know immediately that I had just pulled a miracle out of the dark. I shoved past Eleanor, my heavy boots leaving dark, wet streaks on the white runner. I did not look at the gasping guests. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the man I had practically killed myself to reach. Nolan stepped away from the altar, dropping Sierra's hands. He did not rush forward to see if I was injured. He did not ask about the blood trickling down my neck from the cave rocks. He looked down at my ruined, soaking wet state with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. 3 hours, Ember, Nolan stated coldly. His voice carried effortlessly across the silent chapel, carefully modulated to sound like a long-suffering victim pushed to his absolute breaking point. You were exactly 3 hours late to our wedding. Your lateness today proves exactly what I have been saying for months. You are an absent partner. You have always been an absent partner. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of his words. I was pulling a 7-year-old child out of a flooded sea cave. I rasped, my throat raw from swallowing seawater. He was going to die, Nolan. And I was going to be publicly humiliated, Nolan snapped back, cutting me off loudly. He gestured broadly to the pews of wealthy investors and family members. I could not humiliate myself by standing alone at the altar while you played superhero yet again. You forced my hand. That was when Sierra stepped forward. She moved with a delicate, practiced grace, perfectly adjusting my grandmother's vintage lace veil over her shoulders. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, wearing a mask of faux sympathy so thick it made my stomach churn. Ember, please, you have to try to understand the situation, Sierra cooed softly, though her voice was loud enough for the front rows to hear. You completely broke him today. He was standing here, shattered, realizing you were never going to prioritize him. He was broken, and someone had to show him he was loved. Someone had to step in and remind him that he is worthy of a woman who actually shows up. You stole my groom and my veil in 3 hours, I demanded, my voice trembling not from sadness, but from a rising, terrifying rage. Nolan quickly stepped in front of Sierra, acting as her valiant protector. He turned slightly, raising his voice so the murmuring crowd would hear every single carefully chosen word. Do not attack her, Ember. Sierra is the only innocent person here. Your obsession with that job is a sickness. You neglect everyone around you to chase your own adrenaline highs. I am the victim of your constant neglect. I needed a wife, not a ghost who cares more about the ocean than our future. He was trying to control the narrative. He was putting on a theatrical performance for the crowd, painting himself as the tragic, neglected lover who was forced to find solace in the arms of a loyal friend. But as he spoke, my eyes darted past his shoulder. I noticed something completely out of place. Standing just slightly behind the officiant was a nervous, sleazy-looking man holding a heavy metal embosser. He was not a groomsman. He was a local notary public. Nolan and Sierra were not just holding hands. They were frantically clutching a freshly signed marriage certificate. As Nolan played the victim for the crowd, I watched Sierra subtly nudge the notary, aggressively gesturing for him to stamp the document immediately. Why would they need a notary to aggressively stamp a marriage license right at the altar? My gaze drifted from the strange legal transaction at the altar back toward the heavy oak doors of the vestibule. Stacked neatly in the corner by the coat check was a towering pile of designer luggage. It was not my battered, vintage travel trunks that I had packed for our honeymoon to the Italian coast. It was a matching set of 5 pristine, monogrammed leather suitcases. I recognized the gold initials stamped on the leather. They were Sierra's bags. A cold, paralyzing realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. You do not pack 5 massive suitcases for a European honeymoon in the 3 hours your best friend is late to her wedding. You do not arrange for a notary public to stand by the altar just in case the bride does not show up. This spontaneous, desperate marriage to save Nolan from humiliation was a complete fabrication. This had been meticulously packed for, coordinated, and planned days, perhaps weeks, in advance. They knew I would not be marrying him today. They had banked on it. The burning sensation behind my eyes instantly vanished. The urge to break down, to scream, to fall to my knees and beg for an explanation completely evaporated. I refused to shed a single tear for these monsters. Instead, a chilling, absolute calmness washed over my entire body. The violent shivering stopped. My heart rate slowed to a steady, rhythmic beat, just like it did when I was 60 feet underwater in total darkness. I looked at the handsome architect standing before me, defending the woman wearing my family heirloom. I was not looking at the man I loved. I realized, with absolute clarity, that I was mourning a man who had never actually existed. Nolan was a carefully constructed mirage, a parasite who had mirrored my values just to gain access to my life. And Sierra was the venomous snake I had willingly let sleep in my home. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought my delay was their golden ticket. They had absolutely no idea that the ticking clock they were trying to beat was about to blow up in their faces. The nervous local notary raised his heavy metal embosser, holding it directly over the freshly signed marriage certificate. The mechanical click of the tool was about to permanently seal their legal union. "Put the stamp down on the altar and step away from those documents." A booming, absolute voice echoed from the very back of the vaulted room. The delicate string quartet had completely stopped playing minutes ago, meaning the stranger's command rang out with the force of a gunshot. The sharply dressed man in the nondescript navy suit, whom I had noticed earlier, was marching purposefully down the center aisle. He did not rush, but every single step he took radiated undeniable, clinical authority. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a black leather wallet, and flipped it open to reveal a gleaming gold badge. "I am Special Agent Brody with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division," he announced loudly, ensuring every single guest in the chapel heard his exact title. "Nobody moves. This chapel is now officially an active federal crime scene." The room froze in total paralysis. The notary squeaked in pure terror, dropping the heavy metal stamp as if it were burning hot coal, and scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the stained glass window. Nolan's perfectly rehearsed mask of righteous indignation shattered into a million pieces. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stumbled backward away from the altar, his polished leather shoes slipping wildly on the wet marble floor where I had been standing, nearly taking down a massive arrangement of white roses. Sierra let out a shrill, panicked gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth, violently crushing my grandmother's vintage lace veil in her fists. "What is the meaning of this outrageous interruption?" Eleanor shrieked from the front pew, her wealthy entitlement flaring up. Agent Brody did not even glance at Nolan's mother. His piercing eyes were locked entirely on the terrified groom. "The meaning, ma'am, is that your son is a fraud. Nolan, your commercial architectural firm is not undergoing a massive expansion. In fact, it is completely, hopelessly bankrupt. You are currently $7 million in debt to a syndicate of very dangerous, unregulated private lenders operating out of offshore shell companies." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the congregation. Investors who had funded Nolan's lifestyle began whispering frantically to one another. "And you, Sierra," Agent Brody continued, pivoting his cold gaze to my former best friend. You have not just been helping him plan a wedding, you have been enthusiastically helping him hide those massive debts while carrying on a secret, illicit affair with him for the past 2 years. Sierra's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the wooden altar to keep from collapsing, her flawless influencer facade completely melting away to reveal the terrified, greedy fraud underneath. Agent Brody calmly unclasped his thick manila file. He pulled out a stack of dense, heavily stamped financial records. I have in my hand the finalized paperwork for a $4 million offshore loan. This loan was secured by fraudulently listing the multi-million-dollar Valiant Coast search and rescue property as the primary collateral, a property that belongs entirely and exclusively to Ember Alexander. However, the signature on these documents approving the collateral transfer is a complete forgery, meticulously executed by the two of you. The pieces were violently snapping together in my mind. The late-night blueprint sessions, the constant need for private consultations, the bizarre, ironclad marital contract they had desperately tried to get me to sign. "The bank," I said out loud, my voice cutting sharply through the stunned silence. "They needed the marital contract active today." Agent Brody nodded directly at me, a look of grim professional respect in his eyes. "Exactly. The illicit offshore lender required a legally married couple to sign the final disbursement papers before the international wire transfer window closed at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon." Brody turned back to the trembling newlyweds, his tone shifting into something almost mocking. "When Ember was delayed by 3 hours this morning, your entire scheme fell apart. Sierra, we have the recorded phone calls. We know your private lenders threatened extreme physical violence if the $4 million did not hit their accounts by the deadline today. In a state of sheer, blind panic, you two decided to marry each other right here on the spot. Your brilliant, desperate backup plan was to simply cross Ember's name off the joint asset marital documents, substitute Sierra's name, and forcefully push the paperwork through this clueless local notary so you could get the money and save your own skins." Nolan was openly hyperventilating now. His chest heaved in his tailored tuxedo. "We did not take any money yet," he stammered defensively, raising his shaking hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "The transfer did not happen. The stamp did not touch the paper. We just signed the marriage license. That is all." Agent Brody smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the lethal, highly satisfying grin of a predator that just heard the steel trap snap shut on its prey. "That is the absolute best part. Nolan," Brody said, his voice dropping to a deadly clinical register. "By legally signing that marriage certificate and deliberately attempting to notarize those forged loan documents together at this altar, you did not just betray your fiancé. You and Sierra officially committed federal wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal conspiracy as a legally bound, married couple. You handed me the exact legal leverage I needed to prosecute you both as co-conspirators. You tied the knot perfectly." Nolan's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor, the sharp creases of his charcoal tuxedo crumpling in an instant. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. "Ember, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "Tell the agent this is a massive misunderstanding. Tell him we were going to fix it. We love each other. You have to save me." For the first time since pushing through those heavy oak doors, I genuinely laughed. The sound echoed brightly through the frozen chapel, startling the remaining guests. It was a clear, unburdened sound. "Save you?" I asked, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "Nolan, you really thought I was completely oblivious, did you not? You thought my dedication to the ocean made me blind to my own home? I started looking into your firm weeks ago when the bank sent a strange notice about a lien inquiry to my private mailbox." I looked at Sierra, who was now weeping silently, her flawless makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "That is why your entire desperate scheme was completely pointless from the start," I announced, turning my gaze back to the ruined Groom. "Even if I had signed those documents today, Your offshore lenders would not have given you a single dime. 3 days ago, I quietly met with my own attorneys. I legally transferred the total ownership of the Valiant Coast property into an untouchable state conservation trust. Nolan stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "That is right," I said softly, delivering the final, crushing blow. "My land is permanently protected from private development and entirely immune to asset seizure. You tried to use a multi-million-dollar property as collateral, but as of Tuesday morning, that land is completely worthless to a bank. You forged documents for an asset you could absolutely never touch." Agent Brody did not waste another second. He stepped forward, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly through the chapel as he secured Nolan's wrists, then forcefully spun Sierra around to do the same. The 200 wealthy guests watched in absolute stunned silence as the federal agent marched the newly married couple down the white runner, parading them straight out of the luxurious venue in their pristine, ruined wedding clothes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly light. I looked down at my freezing left hand. I slowly slid the heavy diamond engagement ring off my wrinkled, salt-stained finger. A half-full glass of expensive champagne sat abandoned on a nearby floral pedestal. I dropped the ring directly into the golden liquid. It sank straight to the bottom with a quiet, satisfying clink. I did not look back at the guests, nor at the crying mother of the groom. I turned around and walked out through the heavy oak doors, my head held higher than it had been in years. Exactly 2 weeks later, I sat warmly in the command center of Valiant Coast Search and Rescue. The morning sun illuminated the pristine coastal cliffs outside my window. Resting on my desk was a brightly colored, hand-drawn thank you card. It was from the 7-year-old boy I had pulled from the dark waters of the sea cave. He had drawn a picture of a superhero in a black wetsuit. I looked out over the crashing ocean waves that I had successfully protected, holding the sweet drawing to my chest. Being exactly 3 hours late to my own wedding was not a disaster. It was the universe stepping in to save my entire life, breaking my chains so I was completely free to continue saving others. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Where are you currently listening from? Please let me know down in the comments section. If you found today's story entertaining and empowering, please consider helping our channel with a contribution of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the donation QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and pinned comments. Your generous support allows us to pay our hardworking staff so they have the money to feed their families and can continue creating even better stories to serve our wonderful audience. Stay safe, and thank you again.